Luke didn't have time to respond. The sound of an explosion interrupted the communication. The shield generator was under attack. The Empire had broken through the final line of defense. "Fall back," Luke shouted to the soldiers around him. "We need to protect the shield generator." But it was too late. The Empire's ground forces had already made their move. Rebel soldiers scrambled to defend the generator, but the Empire's power was overwhelming. The blasters from the AT-ATs rained down, and the shield generator's defenses began to crumble. The once impenetrable base was now at the mercy of the Empire. Luke knew they couldn't afford to lose the shield generator. Without it, the transports wouldn't stand a chance against the Empire's firepower. He turned and sprinted toward the generator, but before he could reach it, another explosion rang out, sending him flying backward into the snow. "Luke," Leia's voice crackled over the comms. "Are you all right?" Luke struggled to his feet, his body aching from the blast. "I'm fine. The generator's taking too much damage. We need to evacuate now." Leia's voice was filled with urgency. "We're leaving. We're making the jump to hyperspace, but we can't do it alone. We need you here." Luke hesitated, his mind racing. The battle was far from over, but Leia was right. The rebellion's survival depended on their ability to escape. If they didn't leave Hoth now, the Empire would wipe them out completely. "Understood?" Luke said, his voice firm. He turned and ran toward the transport ships, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the rebellion had lost its final stronghold. But they had one chance to survive, and that was all that mattered now. The turning point. The battle was slipping through the rebels' fingers. The sound of explosions filled the air, and the ground shook with each step of the Empire's mighty AT-AT walkers. Rebel soldiers, despite their bravery, were being overrun. The shield generator was under heavy fire, and with it the last line of defense between the transports and the Empire's overwhelming forces. The rebel base, once a symbol of defiance, was quickly becoming a graveyard for the rebellion's hopes. Inside the command center, Leia stood in front of a holographic map, her expression a mixture of determination and concern. She knew they had to leave Hoth before it was too late. The transports were ready, but without the shield generator, they wouldn't make it off the surface. She had ordered the evacuation to begin, but they couldn't leave without the generator holding long enough to give the fleet a chance. "How much longer?" Leia demanded, her voice steady but laced with urgency. General Riken, who had been monitoring the situation, shook his head. "Not long, Your Highness. We've already lost several key positions. If the shield goes down, the Empire will have us surrounded. We need to pull out immediately." Leia's eyes narrowed. She had always known the risks, but hearing the words out loud made the situation all the more real. They couldn't keep fighting like this. The Empire was too powerful, but she refused to give up. She had fought for so long for the cause of freedom, and she wasn't about to abandon it now. "We'll fight until the end," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "We hold as long as we can, but we make sure those transports leave. If we die here, at least we die fighting for something." Meanwhile, Luke Skywalker had reached the front lines once again, his heart racing as he watched the rebel soldiers struggling to keep the Empire at bay. The shield generator was nearly destroyed, and it was clear that the rebels couldn't hold the base much longer. But Luke refused to give up hope. He had seen the power of the Empire firsthand, but he had also seen the courage of the rebel fighters. "Red 5, we need you to cover the transports," came the voice of his squadron leader over the comms. "We can't afford to lose any more time." Luke nodded, though the reality of the situation weighed heavily on him. The transport ships were preparing to leave, but without the protection of the shield, they would be sitting ducks for the Empire's TIE fighters. The rebels had no choice but to try to protect them, even as their position grew more desperate. "Copy that," Luke responded, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "I'm heading to the transports now." His snowspeeder hummed beneath him as he zoomed across the icy battlefield, the sound of blasters filling the air as rebel pilots fought against the TIE fighters circling above. He could see the transports in the distance, their engines beginning to roar to life as they prepared to make the jump to hyperspace. But there was still so much to do. The Empire was closing in, and they had to buy the transports enough time to escape. Luke's fingers tightened around the controls of his snowspeeder as he locked onto a pair of TIE fighters heading toward the transports. He fired his blasters, hitting one of the fighters and sending it spiraling into the snow. The other TIE fighter broke off its attack, but Luke didn't slow down. He had a job to do. "Good shot, Red 5, came the voice of Biggs over the comms. "But we've got more incoming, stay sharp." Luke didn't respond, his attention fixed on the transports. The rebels had already lost so much, but they couldn't afford to lose their last chance for escape. The transport ships were their only hope now, and Luke knew he had to do everything he could to protect them. As the transports began to lift off from the icy surface of Hoth, the Empire's forces closed in from all sides. The AT-ATs continued to march forward, firing at anything in their path. The last of the rebel soldiers were making their final stand, trying to buy as much time as possible for the ships to escape. But the Empire's firepower was overwhelming. The walkers were almost impossible to take down. Luke's targeting system beeped urgently, and he spotted another AT-AT walker, advancing toward the transports. This one was huge, its massive frame looming over the battlefield like an unstoppable force. Luke's snowspeeder was fast, but it was no match for the AT-AT's firepower. "Red 5, we need to take that walker down," Biggs shouted into the comms. "It's too close to the transports." Luke felt his pulse quicken. They couldn't afford to let the Empire destroy the last of their chances. He locked onto the AT-AT, watching as its blasters fired at the transports. With a deep breath, he dove toward the walker, dodging the incoming fire as his speeder soared through the air. He aimed his harpoon, hoping for a clean shot, and fired. The harpoon struck the walker's massive leg, and Luke pulled hard on the controls. The snowspeeder lurched, using all its strength to drag the walker off balance. With a deafening crash, the AT-AT toppled to the ground, its massive body skidding across the snow. The explosion sent shockwaves through the battlefield, and the rebel pilots let out a cheer of relief. One walker down, but there were still more to deal with. But just as quickly as they had gained ground, the rebels were once again under attack. TIE fighters swarmed around the remaining transport ships, and the AT-ATs continued to advance, their blasters firing relentlessly. The rebels fought back with everything they had, but it was clear that they were running out of time. In the chaos, Luke noticed something. A small, fast-moving ship darting through the sky, its shape unmistakable. The Millennium Falcon had arrived. "Han!" Luke shouted into the comms. "You made it." "We couldn't leave you behind, kid." Han's voice crackled through the static. "We'll cover you as best we can. Get those transports out of here." The sight of the Falcon, with Han and Chewbacca at the helm, filled Luke with hope. With the Falcon's firepower and the last of the rebel pilots holding their ground, the transports finally made their escape, jumping into hyperspace just as the Empire's forces closed in. But the victory was bittersweet. The Empire had taken Echo Base, and the rebels had lost their last stronghold on Hoth. The Empire would follow them, hunting them down, but for now the rebels had survived. And that was all that mattered. As Luke watched the transport ships disappear into the stars, he felt a sense of relief mixed with sadness. The rebellion had lost its base, but it had not lost its spirit. The fight would continue. The Empire might have won this battle, but the war was far from over. The Empire's grip on Hoth tightened with every passing minute. The battle for the rebel base had reached its breaking point. Echo Base, once a sanctuary for the rebellion, was now a battlefield. The shield generator was down, and the remaining rebels had no choice but to evacuate. The Empire's overwhelming firepower had breached the last line of defense, and the fate of the rebellion rested on the success of the escape. Leia Organa paced back and forth in the command center, her mind racing as she coordinated the evacuation efforts. The transports were ready, but the Empire was everywhere. The TIE fighters swarmed the skies, and the remaining AT-AT walkers continued to advance, their powerful blasters laying waste to everything in their path. The rebellion's losses were mounting, but Leia knew they couldn't give up. The survival of the rebellion depended on their ability to get out alive. "Leia," General Reekin's voice broke through her thoughts. He stood beside the holomap, his face etched with worry. "The Empire is moving fast. If we don't get the transports off the ground in the next few minutes, they'll be sitting ducks." Leia took a deep breath, her mind sharp despite the pressure. We'll give them enough time. They have to leave or everything we've worked for is over. Her eyes shifted toward the large viewports where explosions from the battle were visible in the distance. Rebel fighters darted through the icy skies, engaging with the Empire's TIE fighters in a desperate attempt to cover the escape of the transports. Rebel soldiers had already begun their final retreat, moving toward the hangars, but the Empire was relentless. It was a race against time. We've already lost so many, Leia muttered, her voice heavy with the weight of the loss. But we can't afford to lose everything. General Rieken nodded solemnly. We'll hold the line as long as we can, but you need to go. The transports can't wait. Leia met his gaze, her expression determined. I'm not leaving. Without everyone. Leia, Rieken said, his voice softening. You're the heart of this rebellion. Without you, they won't have a leader. They won't know how to fight. You've done your part, but now it's time for you to go. Reluctantly, Leia nodded. She couldn't risk the survival of the entire rebellion just for the sake of staying. She turned to her team, giving them final instructions. The priority now was survival, preserving the rebellion for the next fight. She needed to stay focused, keep the hope alive for those escaping. The Empire had taken their base, but it had not taken their will to resist. Luke Skywalker, meanwhile, was leading the charge on the battlefield. His snowspeeder was once again locked into combat with the Empire's walkers, each step he took, trying to slow down the incoming assault on the rebel forces. Every shot was a calculated risk, each harpoon fired at the legs of the AT-ATs and bringing them down one by one. But even with his best efforts, the destruction of the base seemed inevitable. The icy terrain was littered with rebel ships and fallen soldiers, and Luke knew that every rebel fighter who fell was a sacrifice for the greater cause. He dodged another blast from an AT-AT, then veered off to join a group of rebel pilots preparing for another run at the walkers. There was no time to think, only to act. Every second counted. Red 5, you've got a TIE fighter closing in on your 6. Biggs' voice came through the comms. Luke barely had time to react before the TIE fighter blasted toward him. With a quick roll of his snowspeeder, he narrowly avoided the incoming fire. The TIE fighter missed by inches, but Luke could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The tension in the air was unbearable. The rebellion's fate rested in the balance. But Luke couldn't afford to dwell on it. He needed to focus. Luke's comms crackled again. Red 5, the transports are ready for takeoff. You've got to buy them time. Get to the shield generator and cover the evacuation. Luke's grip tightened on the controls. The shield generator was still standing, but it was only a matter of time before it fell to the Empire. He made a quick decision and veered toward the heart of the battle, the shield generator, the final line of defense. Meanwhile, inside the Millennium Falcon, Han Solo and Chewbacca were already on their way to the hangar, the ship's engines roaring as they cut through the atmosphere. The rebel pilots had done their part to hold off the Empire's forces, but it was clear that they couldn't hold out much longer. The Falcon's firepower and speed were their only chance of getting out alive. Han gripped the controls with determination, his mind focused on the task ahead. Chewie, we've got one shot at this. Once we're in the air, we've got to make the jump to hyperspace fast. The Empire isn't going to give us a break. Chewbacca growled in agreement, his large hands working swiftly to adjust the Falcon's systems. The ship had taken a beating in the battle, but Han trusted it. And more importantly, he trusted himself. He knew the Falcon better than anyone, and he knew how to make it fly under the most dangerous circumstances. Hold on, Chewie, Han muttered. We're about to make this interesting. As they entered the hangar, the Falcon swooped in, its engines roaring as it touched down. Rebel soldiers were already boarding their transports, their faces full of fear but also determination. It was a miracle that they had made it this far, but it wouldn't be enough unless they could escape Hoth and outrun the Empire's forces. Chewie, help get the others to the transports, Han said as he jumped out of the Falcon. I'll make sure we're ready to take off. Chewbacca gave a deep, concerned growl, but he knew what Han meant. They couldn't afford to waste time. The Falcon was their ticket out of Hoth, and Han wasn't going to let anything stop him from getting the ship off the ground. As Han ran toward the transport ships, he caught sight of Leia and Luke's team. We're almost there, he called out, his voice filled with urgency. Get ready, and we'll make the jump to hyperspace." Leia nodded, her heart racing. She was one of the last to board the transport. The rebel soldiers were still struggling to hold the Empire's forces back, but the transports had begun lifting off from the icy surface of Hoth. The escape was happening, but they couldn't relax yet. The Empire's firepower was immense, and there was still so much at stake. The transports rose into the sky, their engines roaring as they made a break for the safety of space. The sky above Hoth was filled with the sounds of the battle. The blasts of TIE fighters, the rumble of the AT-ATs, and the desperate fire of the rebels. For a moment it felt as though the entire planet was on the brink of collapse, but the transports were escaping one by one into the stars. Luke, watching from above in his snowspeeder, glanced down at the chaos below. The rebellion had lost its base, but they were far from finished. The fight would continue. They had survived, and that survival meant that the Empire had not yet won. The battle on Hoth had raged for hours, and now, as the transports ascended into the icy atmosphere, the fate of the Rebel Alliance hung by a thread. The Empire had shattered their base, but the rebels had survived. Barely. As the last of the transport ships began to break through the atmosphere, the rebel fighters and ground forces gave their final push, determined to ensure the escape of those still on Hoth. Leia Organa, her face tense but determined, sat in the cockpit of the transport, staring out the viewports at the retreating battlefield below. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, loss, relief, and the overwhelming feeling of responsibility for those who had survived and those who hadn't. The transports had finally left the surface of Hoth, but the Empire wasn't far behind. Behind her, in the cargo hold, the other rebel soldiers were seated, some still catching their breath, others silently reflecting on the losses they had suffered. The base had fallen, and the Empire had claimed victory on the ground, but the rebellion's spirit was unbroken. Leia, though filled with sorrow for those left behind, knew this was not the end. It was just another beginning. "We've made it this far," Leia said quietly into the comms, addressing the rest of the fleet. "Now we just need to get to safety. Stay together, keep alert, and watch for the Empire. We're not out of danger yet." Leia had known from the beginning that their time on Hoth was limited. They'd been discovered, and the Empire would not rest until they had eradicated the last of the rebellion. But her determination was unwavering. She had seen too many soldiers fight and die for this cause. The rebellion was more than just a military force. It was a symbol of hope. And hope was something the galaxy needed more than ever. Meanwhile, the remaining rebel pilots were doing everything in their power to keep the Empire's TIE fighters at bay. Luke Skywalker, once again in his snowspeeder, had managed to take down a few more of the advancing AT-AT walkers, but the battle was winding down. The rebel forces, though brave, had been outmatched. The Empire's superior numbers and firepower had made it clear that this battle would not end in victory for the rebellion. Luke flew his snowspeeder toward a group of TIE fighters closing in on the last of the transports. His hands were steady on the controls, though his mind raced. He had done his part. He had taken down more walkers than anyone expected. But the rebellion's survival would depend on how fast they could escape. The Empire's grasp. "Red 5, you got ties on your tail," came the warning over the comms. Big's voice sounded strained. "I've got this," Luke responded, tightening his grip on the controls. He could see the transports in the distance, their engines glowing as they made their way toward the safety of hyperspace. He wasn't going to let them be caught, not after everything they'd been through. Luke pulled his snowspeeder into a sharp dive, dodging fire from the TIE fighters as he positioned himself between the enemy and the transports. The TIE fighters were nimble, but Luke had learned to anticipate their movements. His targeting system beeped as he locked onto one of the enemy ships, and with a quick squeeze of the trigger, a burst of blaster fire sent the TIE fighter spiraling out of control. "Good shot, Red 5, Biggs called out over the comms. "Keep it up!" Luke didn't respond. He couldn't afford distractions now. Another TIE fighter appeared in his sights, and this time, the targeting system was slow to lock on. The tension was building, and the seconds felt like hours as Luke waited for the right moment. He knew he had to make it count. There was no room for mistakes. With a steady hand, Luke fired again. The TIE fighter exploded in a flash of light, debris scattering across the sky. One more down, but there were still more to go. The battle was far from over. Meanwhile, Han Solo and Chewbacca were engaged in their own fight. The Millennium Falcon weaved through the sky, its blasters firing as the rebel ship's engines roared. Han gripped the controls, his focus on the battle unfolding around him. The transports were making their escape, but they were being pursued by TIE fighters, and the Falcon was the only ship that could cover them. "Chewie, we need to get those TIEs off our back," Han yelled, his voice full of urgency. The Falcon's guns lit up, firing at the TIE fighters closing in on the transports. Han's quick reflexes and knowledge of the Falcon's weapon systems allowed him to take down 2 more fighters, but the job wasn't done yet. The Empire's relentless pursuit was evident, and the rebel forces were slowly being overwhelmed. However, thanks to the sacrifices of the pilots and the defensive efforts of the remaining soldiers, the last of the transport ships made their way into the clear. As they gained distance from the battlefield, the first transport ship made the jump to hyperspace, disappearing into the safety of the stars. "Transports are away," Biggs called out over the comms. "They're jumping to hyperspace now." Luke exhaled in relief, but he knew they couldn't celebrate yet. The Empire was still in pursuit, and the rebel forces would need to regroup. There was no time to rest, not until they were out of the Empire's reach. "We've done it," Luke said quietly to himself. Though the battle was far from over, they had lost the base, and many of their comrades had fallen. But the rebellion had survived. For now, that was all that mattered. The fight for the galaxy's freedom would continue. As the rebel transports began to vanish into the stars, Leia, who was seated in the transport ship she had boarded, allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The weight of the battle was heavy, but the fact that they had escaped Hoth was a victory in itself. The Empire had not broken them. "We're not finished," Leia said to herself, a resolve hardening in her chest. The rebellion was scattered now, but it was far from destroyed. The Empire might have won this battle, but the war was still alive. The transport ship entered hyperspace. Luke's eyes turned toward the stars, knowing that the battle for freedom was far from over. The rebellion had taken a great blow, but their spirit would not be broken. He would stand with his friends, with his comrades, and together they would keep fighting until the Empire fell. The cold, harsh winds of Hoth had been replaced by the deep, endless black of space. The rebel transport ships were scattered across the stars, their engines glowing brightly as they made their way toward safety. The battle had been brutal, and the cost of survival had been high. The Empire had claimed Echo Base, but the rebellion, though fractured, had not been defeated. Their fight for freedom was far from over. Leia Organa sat in the cockpit of her transport ship, staring out into the vastness of space. The cold void felt endless, but in that emptiness, Leia found a strange sense of calm. The transport was safely away from Hoth, and the rebellion had survived, at least for now. The faces of her fallen comrades haunted her thoughts. She could see their faces clearly in her mind, the brave men and women who had fought and died to make this escape possible. "Leia," a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was General Reekin's voice crackling over the comms. "We've made it out of the system. The Empire won't be able to track us now. For now, we're safe." Leia's shoulders sagged with relief, though the burden of leadership never left her. She had done what she could, and now the rebellion had to regroup. "Thank you, General. We've lost so much, but we've made it. That's what matters." "The rebellion lives on," General Reekin replied. "We've survived today, but we'll have to move quickly. The Empire won't stop until they've hunted us down. We'll need to find a new base somewhere the Empire can't reach." Leia nodded, the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her. "I know, the Empire won't rest, but we'll find a way. We always do." As she looked around at the other transports, Leia knew that the rebellion's survival wasn't guaranteed. The Empire had dealt them a crushing blow on Hoth, but their spirit remained unbroken. They had lost many, but they had gained something even more important: hope. The Empire might have the power to crush a base, to destroy a fleet, but they couldn't destroy the will of those who fought for freedom. Meanwhile, Luke Skywalker sat in the cockpit of his snowspeeder, staring out into the blackness of space. The battle was over, and the transport ships had made their escape. But despite the victory of survival, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost. The rebellion had survived, but the cost had been heavy. He thought of the soldiers, the pilots, the friends who had given their lives so that others could escape. Luke's hand rested on the controls as he reflected on the battle. He had fought in countless battles, but the loss of Echo Base, the loss of so many comrades, weighed on him. Yet he knew that he couldn't dwell on the loss. The rebellion was not finished. There was still work to be done, still hope to be found. "We did it, kid." Han Solo's voice came through his comms, interrupting Luke's thoughts. "We got them out of there." Luke managed a small smile. "We made it, but it's not over yet." Han's voice was filled with his usual cocky confidence. "Yeah, well, we're alive, and that's more than I thought we'd be. You know, you can't keep a good rebel down." Luke chuckled softly, but there was little humor in it. "I hope you're right, Han. The Empire won't stop, but we can't stop either." "We won't," Han replied firmly. "The rebellion lives. As long as we're still fighting, they can't win." Luke thought of Yoda, of the Jedi training that awaited him. His journey wasn't over. He had a destiny to fulfill, and the Force was calling him. But before he could begin that journey, he knew there was still so much to do. The rebellion needed him, and so did the galaxy. As the rebel ships moved farther from Hoth, the stars stretching out before them, Luke felt a strange sense of peace. It was fleeting, but it was there. The Empire had destroyed Echo Base, but they had not destroyed the rebellion. The loss was painful, but it was not final. The fight for freedom would continue. Leia, Han, and Luke all knew that the Empire would come after them. They would keep hunting the rebellion, trying to stamp out every last vestige of resistance. But the rebellion was not just a military force. It was an idea. It was the belief that freedom was worth fighting for, and that belief would never die. The ships left Hoth behind and entered hyperspace. The survivors of the Battle of Hoth could take a moment to breathe. But there was no time for celebration. The rebellion was scattered, but it was far from defeated. There was still hope in the galaxy, and as long as that hope remained, the fight would continue. The stars ahead of them were endless, but for the first time the rebellion saw them not as a vast empty void, but as a field of possibilities. The Empire might have crushed one base, one world, but the rebellion would not stop. They would fight on, and eventually they would win. The Empire's time was coming to an end. It was only a matter of time before the rebellion would rise up and take back the galaxy. And so the fight for the galaxy's freedom continued, with every rebel who survived carrying the torch for those who had fallen. They had lost a battle, but they would win the war.